The United States District Court for the Northern District of California fell silent as Judge Edward Chen leaned forward, a faint, amused smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The wood-paneled courtroom, typically reserved for high-stakes tech litigation, was packed wall-to-wall with journalists, legal analysts, and curious onlookers. At the defendant's table, Sylvester Stallone sat upright, his hands gently clasped on the polished oak surface, his expression calm but unreadable. Once celebrated as the voice of the underdog through iconic characters like Rocky Balboa and John Rambo, Stallone now found himself in a very different kind of fight. A battle not waged with fists or sheer willpower, but with words and legal documents. Moments earlier, Stallone's legal team had delivered their final argument, a passionate plea asserting that Stallone had been systematically denied rightful royalties and creative credit by a major Hollywood studio, despite the company earning billions from his work over decades. Judge Chen cleared his throat, the sound echoing crisply through the silent chamber. "Mr. Stallone," he began, his voice composed but tinged with unmistakable skepticism, "you argue that, although you voluntarily signed these contracts over many years, you are now owed compensation based on artistic spirit?" There was a pause, a beat. The judge gave a slight shake of his head and set down the legal brief he'd been reviewing. "That argument," Chen continued, "isn't just unconventional. It's cinematic to the point of being entertaining." And then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Judge Chen laughed, a short, dismissive chuckle, subtle but brutal in its message. In the back rows, journalists froze mid-note. Pens hovered in mid-air. Was this really happening? A federal judge laughing at Sylvester Stallone, the man who had inspired millions with stories of struggle, redemption, and relentless determination? Stallone's lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. The man himself remained motionless. No raised brow, no spark of anger. Just the slow, patient blink of someone who had weathered harsher fights. The laughter faded, but its sting lingered in the air, like a faint aftershock. "This court," Judge Chen resumed with a more serious tone, "is bound by law and precedent, not sentiment. Charisma, legacy, even decades of cultural impact, however admirable, cannot rewrite binding legal agreements. The Tesla CEO had once sat in this very room, chastised for oversized ego. Today, it was Sylvester Stallone's turn, though his fault was not arrogance, but the stubborn belief that heart and soul should count, even in a room governed by cold, formal contracts. Papers rustled on the plaintiff's table. The attorneys for Paramount Pictures, the studio in question, could barely conceal their satisfaction. In their minds, the case was already won. Stallone's emotionally compelling claims had been neatly reframed as nostalgic but legally irrelevant. Still, Stallone sat calmly, eyes fixed on the judge, taking it all in. He had been laughed at before, countless times. When he first pitched the original Rocky script in the early 1970s, studios had mocked the idea of casting an unknown, mumbly actor in the lead role. Stallone had refused to sell the script unless he could star in it himself. He had survived living in a one-room apartment in New York, pawning jewelry, even selling his beloved dog to afford food, before Rocky changed his life forever. This courtroom, with its polished floors and rigid decorum, was just another arena. And he wasn't done fighting. Judge Chen, for his part, showed no sign of softening. "The law values fairness," he declared firmly, "but fairness is achieved through structure, through contracts, negotiations, and the discipline of honoring terms both parties agreed upon. Once more, he looked directly at Stallone. Hollywood may thrive on reinvention, Mr. Stallone. The courts do not. A few soft chuckles rippled through the crowd. Somewhere in the third row, a young associate on the studio's legal team smirked and nudged her colleague. Still, Stallone sat like stone. Calm, watching, waiting. Outside the towering courthouse on Golden Gate Avenue, camera crews gathered to broadcast the slow unraveling of Stallone's legal bid. On CNN, a legal analyst remarked that Stallone's case was driven more by nostalgia than by enforceable rights. Fox News offered a more sympathetic tone, framing Stallone as another American legend caught in the gears of a system that no longer values loyalty. Meanwhile, deep within his own mind, Stallone wasn't thinking about headlines or damage control. He was remembering. He remembered being 29, broke and desperate, walking into dingy offices on Sunset Boulevard with a torn-up script tucked under his arm. He remembered the 1,000 rejections, the laughter, the slammed doors, and he remembered standing his ground back then, just as he would now. The morning session continued, increasingly lopsided. Judge Chen cited case after case. Screenwriters who had lost their rights, actors unable to reclaim royalties decades later, landmark rulings that offered no easy path forward for Stallone. By the time the judge called for a lunch recess, the tone was clear. Stallone's legal fight was collapsing. In the courthouse hallway, reporters clustered around flustered spokespeople. Headlines flashed on smartphone screens. Stallone's final round falters in courtroom clash. Judge Chen laughs off Stallone's claims. Inside a private meeting room, Stallone's legal team huddled around a scratched oak table, voices low and urgent. Richard Falk, Stallone's lead attorney, wiped his glasses and tried to sound hopeful. "We can negotiate a settlement," he said. "Preserve some goodwill. You'll walk away looking principled, even if we don't win." Stallone stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the fog roll in from the bay. The grandeur of San Francisco stretched out before him, tough, stubborn, proud. He turned and spoke quietly. "No." His team fell silent. "We're not settling," Stallone said, voice low but resolute. "We're not here just to save face." Falk hesitated. "Sly, you heard the judge. These contracts are ironclad. You're going to lose." "I've lost before," Stallone said simply. "Losing isn't the end." His team exchanged glances, sensing something shift in the room. "What are you planning to do?" Falk asked cautiously. Stallone's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Change the fight," he said. "Not for me. For every kid who ever thought they didn't belong at the table." At that moment, across the street, the noonday bells of St. Boniface Church rang faintly, their sound swallowed by the hum of the city. Inside the courtroom, the stage was already set for a slow, methodical defeat. But Stallone wasn't preparing for defeat. He was preparing for a different kind of victory, one the court hadn't anticipated, and no gavel could silence. When the court reconvened after the lunch recess, the atmosphere inside courtroom 5B had shifted subtly. It was hard to describe at first, just a tightening of the air, a hush deeper than mere protocol demanded. Perhaps it was the way Sylvester Stallone walked back into the room, unhurried, shoulders squared, gaze steady. Perhaps it was the instinctive sense that every soul packed into the gallery understood, somehow, that they were about to witness something unusual. Judge Chen settled into his bench, glancing briefly at Stallone with an expression that flickered, Was it curiosity? Before returning to his standard neutrality. The attorney shifted papers, pulled up exhibits, prepared for another dry dissection of contractual clauses. But Stallone, standing now, hands calmly clasped in front of him, addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor," Stallone began, his voice carrying with a quiet force that silenced even the idle scribbling of pens. "If it pleases the court, I would like permission to speak not as an attorney, but as the man who lived the story behind these contracts." Judge Chen's brows knit together. Speaking directly, especially without counsel's interjection, was highly irregular. Every courtroom procedure advised against it. Still, there was something in Stallone's demeanor, not defiant, not desperate, but simply genuine, that made the judge pause. After a measured moment, he nodded once. "Proceed, Mr. Stallone," he said, his tone still formal, but lacking the earlier edge of mockery. Stallone took a breath, the kind of breath a fighter takes before stepping into the ring. "When I wrote the first script that changed my life," he said, voice steady, "I was a nobody. I didn't have a name anyone respected, or a dollar to my name. I had a dream, and a dog, and a battered typewriter." A few soft chuckles rose from the gallery, not mocking but warm. Stallone continued, "I signed contracts back then that weren't favorable, because when you're hungry, literally hungry, you don't have the luxury of bargaining. You grab your one shot and you don't look back." His gaze swept the room, landing on the studio attorneys, on the judge, on the packed gallery. "I'm not asking this court to rewrite history. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for acknowledgement, for fairness, for the idea that a man's soul, poured into his work, still means something." The room was utterly still now. Even the seasoned legal analysts, people who had covered decades of courtroom drama, leaned forward slightly, drawn in despite themselves. Stallone didn't speak like a lawyer. He spoke like a man standing at the crossroads of pride and loss. He spoke for every artist, every dreamer who had ever been told their work was just another line item in a ledger. Stallone took another step forward. "That's why," he said, "regardless of this case's outcome, I'm creating the Fighters Fund. It will protect young screenwriters, independent filmmakers, and artists who are too often crushed before they even get their first real chance." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and even Judge Chen sat back slightly, absorbing the words. "And," Stallone continued, voice low but fierce, "I am formally relinquishing all future profit claims tied to the disputed works in this case. Instead, those proceeds will fund scholarships for veterans returning to civilian life, helping them learn film production, screenwriting, and storytelling, skills that gave me a second life when I needed it most." The studio lawyers scrambled through their notes, whispering urgently among themselves. This wasn't part of any anticipated legal maneuver. Stallone wasn't arguing anymore. He was acting unilaterally, without strings attached. It was no longer about percentages or royalties. It was about legacy, about principles larger than any contract. Judge Chen leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Stallone," he said, his tone more cautious now, "you understand that such declarations, while admirable, have no bearing on the enforceability of existing contracts?" Stallone smiled, a small, almost private expression. "I understand that, Your Honor. I'm not here to change the law. I'm here to do what's right, whether the law recognizes it or not." For several long moments, the courtroom remained suspended in a rare, almost sacred silence. It wasn't the silence of legal formality. It was the silence that falls when people witness something they know will be remembered. In the press rows, reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. This wasn't just another celebrity lawsuit. It was turning into something far more resonant. Stallone returned to his seat, unhurried. His attorneys looked at him with a mixture of astonishment and deep respect. Even the opposing counsel, for all their professional duty, struggled to maintain the veneer of detached superiority. Judge Chen cleared his throat, his next words carrying a slight but unmistakable weight. The court commends Mr. Stallone for his commitment to supporting the arts and the veteran community. However, we must proceed with the matter at hand. And so, the legal arguments resumed, but the soul of the room had shifted. Where earlier there had been a sense of inevitability, of a giant slowly crushing a smaller figure, now there was tension, uncertainty, even admiration flickering beneath the surface. As Stallone's team presented their final summaries, there was an undeniable undercurrent among the spectators. It wasn't about whether Stallone would win or lose in the legal sense. It was about what he had already reclaimed: his dignity, his voice, his ability to inspire, not through victory, but through action. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, beneath the bright San Francisco sun, clusters of veterans, young filmmakers, and even longtime fans of Stallone's movies began to gather. Word of his courtroom declaration had spread rapidly, amplified by social media posts and urgent news flashes. Local TV crews rushed to capture interviews. A retired Marine in a worn bomber jacket told a reporter, tears in his eyes, "The man never forgot where he came from. That's the kind of hero we still need." Meanwhile, within the paneled walls of the courtroom, the final motions wound down. Judge Chen, true to form, maintained his focus on the legal specifics. Whether the contracts Stallone had signed decades ago could be revisited based on principles of equity or newly discovered financial discrepancies. The answer, as expected, leaned heavily against Stallone. Precedent was precedent. But a funny thing had happened during the course of the day. Stallone had already won something more enduring than damages or back pay. In cities across America, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Philadelphia, places where Rocky Balboa had once captured the imagination of working-class heroes, people were tuning in, not to mourn a legal defeat, but to celebrate the enduring spirit of a man who refused to be defined by it. As the session neared its end, Judge Chen addressed the court. His voice, while formal, carried a subtle, almost reluctant warmth. This court recognizes Mr. Stallone's extraordinary contributions to American culture, and his decision to invest in future generations speaks for itself. Let the record show that whatever the legal resolution, a greater good has been served here today. Stallone bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect. The gavel came down. The courtroom emptied slowly, people lingering as if reluctant to step away from a moment they knew they'd remember. In the fading light of late afternoon, as Stallone exited the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into applause. He didn't wave or pump his fists. He simply nodded, his eyes misting slightly, as he walked among them, one man carrying the gratitude of many. As news outlets scrambled to cover every angle of what was quickly being dubbed Stallone's stand, there was a sense of something rare happening, a reminder that even in a cynical age, authenticity still mattered, courage still resonated, and sometimes Losing in court could mean winning where it counted most, in the hearts of the people who believed in you. In the days following the courtroom decision, the story of Sylvester Stallone's stand spread across the country like a spark catching dry prairie grass. Local news stations picked up the footage first, showing clips of Stallone's calm, yet powerful speech, the announcement of the Fighters Fund, and the wave of public support that greeted him as he stepped out onto Golden Gate Avenue. By the time the weekend rolled around, national networks like NBC and CBS were running segments titled A Real-Life Rocky Moment and Stallone's Greatest Role Yet, Champion of the Underdogs. In towns far from San Francisco, in living rooms and diners and barber shops, people who had grown up watching Stallone's movies nodded approvingly as they watched him once again defy the odds, not by throwing a punch or winning a trophy, but by standing for something larger than himself. In Philadelphia, where the famous Rocky statue stood near the steps of the Art Museum, someone quietly placed a fresh bouquet of red, white, and blue flowers at its base with a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for fighting for us." In Detroit, a group of young screenwriters gathered at a local library, inspired by Stallone's pledge to fund new creative voices, and started sketching out the first scenes of their own movie about perseverance. Across small towns in Ohio, Texas, and Pennsylvania, veterans groups met to discuss how they might apply for scholarships from the new foundation once it became official. Something had been stirred that went far beyond the outcome of a single legal case. It was as if Stallone's refusal to bow, his choice to invest in others instead of merely defending himself, had reignited a sense of possibility that many had quietly believed was slipping away in modern America. For Stallone himself, the following days were a strange mix of quiet reflection and overwhelming gratitude. The night after the court ruling, he stayed at a modest hotel not far from the courthouse, eschewing luxury for simplicity. Sitting alone by a small window overlooking the city lights, he sipped black coffee and scrolled through countless messages of support from fans, veterans, aspiring artists, and even a few people from Hollywood who admitted, sometimes sheepishly, that they had underestimated him. Among the messages was a video sent by a group of young filmmakers in Chicago. They held up handmade signs that read, "You inspired us to believe. Thank you, Sly." Watching the shaky footage, Stallone felt a lump rise in his throat, unexpected and humbling. After all the years, after all the battles fought and wounds carried, it wasn't awards or box office numbers that mattered most. It was this: the connection, the impact, the reminder that telling stories and standing by them still meant something. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, the studio that had been Stallone's legal opponent issued a carefully worded press release, praising his contributions to American cinema and expressing a willingness to collaborate on the future administration of the Fighters Fund. Industry insiders understood the subtext. They knew that in the court of public opinion, Stallone had achieved an overwhelming victory, and no studio wanted to be seen as standing against that tide. Even Hollywood, a place often cynical about genuine gestures, could recognize when a tide had shifted. Donations poured into the new fund. Foundations supporting veteran causes offered partnerships. Law schools began adding case studies to their ethics courses, discussing the implications of Stallone's actions in a world where most legal battles were won by those who shouted the loudest, spent the most, or delayed the longest. 3 weeks later, in a sunlit hall at the San Francisco Film Center in the Presidio, Stallone stood quietly backstage, adjusting the cuffs of his simple navy blazer. The Fighters Fund was officially launching, and the small theater was packed with young writers, veterans, students, and supporters. American flags lined the modest stage, and a large screen behind the podium showed images from Stallone's career. Not the glamorous premieres, but candid shots, writing scripts by hand, training in battered gyms, visiting troops overseas. As his name was announced, the room rose in a standing ovation before he even stepped into view. Stallone smiled, humbled once more, and made his way to the microphone. He spoke without notes. His voice, roughened by age but steady, filled the room. "I know what it feels like to be told you're not good enough," he said. "I know what it's like to have doors slammed in your face, to be laughed at, to be doubted." He paused, scanning the faces before him, young and old, hopeful and weathered. "But I also know this. You don't have to accept it. You can fight back. You can stand up. You can prove that you matter, even if the world doesn't see it yet." He spoke about the first time he walked into a casting office and was told he should stick to manual labor. He spoke about nearly giving up, about the thin thread of hope that kept him going when logic said to quit. "You are not defined by what people say about you," he said, his voice growing stronger. "You are defined by what you choose to believe about yourself." The room was silent, hanging on every word. He laid out the details of the Fighters Fund, how it would offer grants to young artists, provide scholarships to veterans, fund mentorships with experienced filmmakers. But more than that, he said, it would stand as a declaration that dreams still matter, that grit still matters, that the spirit of the underdog, the fighter with nothing but heart, still deserved a place in America's story. After the speech, as Stallone mingled with the attendees, a young man in his 20s wearing an old Navy jacket approached him, clutching a worn notebook. His hands trembled slightly. "Sir," he said, "I was ready to give up on this. Writing, dreaming, figured it wasn't worth it. But then I saw what you did, and I'm going to keep going, no matter what." Stallone placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said softly, "That's all that matters. Keep going." Later that night, as he returned to his modest hotel room, Stallone sat down heavily on the bed and gazed out at the darkened city. The legal loss didn't sting anymore. It felt insignificant now, a footnote to a story that had taken on a life of its own. He thought about the faces he had seen that day, the tear-filled eyes, the quiet nods, the unspoken understanding that sometimes standing up for yourself meant standing up for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. In the end, Stallone realized, it wasn't about contracts or settlements or verdicts. It was about keeping faith with the dreamers, about honoring the fight, even when the odds seemed impossible, about knowing that sometimes, even when you lose, you still win in the ways that matter most. Somewhere in the distance, the city hummed with life, streetcars rattling down hills, ships calling out low notes over the bay, late-night diners spilling soft yellow light onto cracked sidewalks. It was the sound of people moving forward, stubborn and hopeful, a little bruised but unbroken. And sitting quietly in that small room, Sylvester Stallone smiled to himself, a quiet, private smile of a man who understood, perhaps better than most, that real victories are rarely won in courts or on battlefields. They are won in the hearts of those who refuse to give up. They are won every time someone chooses to believe again.